the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, welcome to the Happy Families Podcast. My name is Dr. Justin Coulson. Every Wednesday, we bring you an interview with somebody who knows stuff that you need to know so that you can make your family happier. Today, an interview with an author, in fact, the world's leading, most recognized academic thinker. I would have loved to have had him with me to have this conversation, but some people are just a bit too hard to get a hold of. And so what I've done today is lent heavily on a podcast interview that Professor Jonathan Haidt from New York University had with Barry Weiss on the Honestly podcast. I'm going to just share a couple of quick snippets of what he had to say, share a few of my own ideas around that as well, and hopefully have a really constructive conversation that sounds like an interview based on his brand new book, The Anxious Generation. So let me tell you a bit about who Jonathan Haidt is. Many years ago, I read one of his first books. I think it might have even been his first book. It was called The Happiness Hypothesis. It remains to this day my favorite book about well-being and happiness. The guy is just a phenomenal thinker and such a clear communicator. You might also have heard of Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind, or The Coddling of the American Mind. The new book is called The Anxious Generation. I've pre-ordered mine. The book has now come out. I still haven't received my pre-ordered one. That's one of the disadvantages sometimes when you do a pre-order. You miss out. But Professor Haidt has been absolutely blitzing podcasts and media right around the world and has reached so many people. He also has a free Substack called After Babel. You can subscribe and support the work that he does. I recommend it. It's absolutely brilliant. So let's get on to the conversation that he had with Barry Weiss of the Honestly podcast, Honestly with Barry Weiss, part of the Free Press. This is what he had to say when Barry Weiss asked him, Jonathan, where is the anxiety with this anxious generation coming from?
It's all the little small stuff that was unpleasant as a child. So it's being excluded. It's vital that kids be excluded. Can you imagine? So I'm sorry, your daughter is what? How old now? 2, 3?
Yeah, she's less than 2. Yeah, we're not at the excluding Mean Girls phase yet.
Okay, but Barry, so suppose
we'll get there.
That's right, you will. And so, given that she's going to get there, if I gave you the option, I said, if you sign this deal, I can guarantee you that she will never face exclusion before her 18th birthday. Would you sign it?
No.
Right, because we know intuitively that they have to experience it. Otherwise, it's going to be devastating when they're 18. And it's the same thing for, let's say, losing. It's very important that children lose a lot in competitive games. Now, I remember when my kids were young, it was very painful for them to lose. They would sometimes get upset. But after a while, then they just, then they get used to it. And now you can have a lot more fun because they know we're going to play 20 games and I'm going to lose a bunch of them and win a bunch of them. So winning and losing, being excluded, certainly, falling down and getting hurt. And then getting hurt when there's no adult around. So, like I remember crashing on my bicycle and you have to kind of limp home and maybe the pedal is bent but you get home and then you realize, I can do that. I can get home.
I really love this conversation. The idea that there are healthy stresses in the environment. Now, we've got pretty good research that shows that if we experience way too much stress at a developmentally inappropriate age or just in an inappropriate way, that stress can lead to negative outcomes. But that's not what he's talking about here. And what people like me and obviously Jonathan Haidt and many others who do this kind of work have seen is that increasingly as we invest more and more into our children, that parental investment is very much oriented towards protecting our children from healthy stresses, the kind of stresses that build resilience and reduce anxiety. In fact, not in that part of the interview, but certainly in research that I've read, there is good data that shows that when our children are exposed to developmentally appropriate and healthy stresses, they do better. They're less likely to experience anxiety disorders. They're more likely to thrive. There's a metaphor, an analogy that I use when I'm giving my presentations on resilience in schools and in organizations. And I use the idea of a balance beam. So when your children are walking through life, metaphorically, they're walking across a balance beam. Some parents, when they see their child start to overbalance, maybe lean a little too far to the left or right, they kind of stand back and say, well, you're going to figure this out, kiddo. And sometimes their kids fall and they hit the ground. The difficulty with that, I'm going to call it the toughen up princess approach to building resilience, is research shows it doesn't work. Sometimes that fall is too far, developmentally inappropriate, too hard. And it's so important that as parents, we're discerning enough to recognize that it's not going to be in our kids' best interest to keep on falling off the balance beam of life. Don't see that happening as much as it used to. What I see happening a lot more now is that parents will get up onto the balance beam with their kids and carry them across. But you cannot carry your kids through life. And that's why it's just so important. In fact, that creates something called the cycle of incompetence, which we're going to talk about in just a sec. What I encourage parents to do is to walk alongside their children as they're up on that beam. And as their child starts to overbalance, it's completely appropriate to put your hand up on their leg, on their thigh, and say, hey, just lean on me for a second while you regain your bearings, regain your balance. Let's work out how you can take the next step on your own. Then you take your hand away and your kids take those steps on their own with a supportive, loving, compassionate adult beside them. All of the very best work on resilience shows that the kids who are most resilient are the ones who have at least one significant and supportive adult in their lives. But those adults don't do the work for them. They also just make sure that they don't fall and crash. Or if they do, that it's not too hard, that there's something supporting that landing. I think it's so important if we want to move away from raising an anxious generation that we get the balance right, if you'll pardon the pun. Now, the second highlight from the conversation that Jonathan Haidt had with the Honestly podcast and Barry Weiss related to a concept called anti-fragility. There's a book called Anti-fragile. It's on my bookshelf. It's by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And the idea of anti-fragile goes like this. We often think that the opposite of resilience is fragility, but that's not entirely true. See, resilience, if we look at it from an engineering perspective, you build a resilient house, a resilient bridge, a resilient stadium or road. And what that means is that when the traffic or the weight or the rain or the floods or whatever it is, when those things hit it, it stays firm. Fragile means that when adversity strikes, you break down. Now, staying firm is not the opposite of breaking down. Getting stronger is the opposite of breaking down, but we don't have a word for it in English. And so Nassim Taleb calls it anti-fragility, being anti-fragile. And that's what this second clip is all about, how we help our kids to be anti-fragile.
So because we came to see our children as vulnerable or fragile rather than anti-fragile, if you see your kids as anti-fragile, say, go out and play. And if they say, it's cold out, you say, tough it out. Or, if they fall, say, you're okay, go back. So that's what you would do if you think kids are anti-fragile. But if you think kids are fragile, you're going to never leave them unsupervised, which means they never learn to work things out for themselves. And you're going to swoop in at this first sign of trouble. And so what happens if you assume that they're incompetent and fragile, then they don't have the experience that would make them competent and non-fragile. So you're actually making them incompetent and fragile. And then you look at these incompetent, fragile, fifth graders. And then you say, well, how can we trust you? I can't let you walk to the store. What if you get lost? It's a cycle. It's a vicious cycle. And so that's what we have to break.
So I really love a handful of elements in here. One of the central things that I'd highlight is what we've got is one of the world's leading thinkers saying a little bit of tough love is okay for your kids. Now, this isn't any kind of neglectful or abusive or aggressive tough love. Rather, it's acknowledging that the everyday bumps and scrapes of life can be gotten over by our children, and we shouldn't make too big a deal of them. The more we make their emotions king, and the more we make their discomfort a problem that needs to be fixed, the less anti-fragile, the more fragile they become, and the more we perpetuate that cycle of incompetence. We need to get comfortable with our kids being uncomfortable in an understanding, appropriate, caring, compassionate way. But we still need to say, and I'll do this all the time when my kids, when they've hurt themselves, I'll say, oh, kiddo, that looks like it really hurt. Come and give me a hug. I'll give them a hug. And then I'll say, all right, off you go. It looks like you'll be okay now. So there can still be that kindness and that warmth, that nurture, that relatedness, the mattering and belonging. That's all part of it. But ultimately, we're saying, I have faith in your ability to figure this out and to move ahead with it. As we encourage our kids to become more competent, they get out of that cycle. But we need to understand why we are uncomfortable. What is it in us that's causing us to be so uncomfortable with our children experiencing hardship, difficulty, challenge? As we get comfortable with them having that difficulty and having that growth, they're much more likely to figure this out. In just a sec, we're going to talk about how the adolescent brain changes during the teen years and the impact of social media on those changes. It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the Happy Families podcast with me, Dr. Justin Coulson, and some snippets from an interview with Professor Jonathan Haidt from New York University, the author of The Anxious Generation, talking with the Free Press's Barry Weiss on the Honestly with Barry Weiss podcast. Everybody knows that the adolescent brain changes so much during those teen years, but what's the impact of social media on those changes? Jonathan Haidt explains this to Barry Weiss in the Honestly podcast.
The brain grows very quickly in the first few years of life, and then it actually slows down a lot. And from then on, it's not so much growth. It's rewiring, it's neurons connecting, it's synapses forming, it's neurons fading away, if they're not used. So there's a lot of rewiring going on, and that speeds up during puberty. There was especially early puberty around age 11 or 12 to around 15, 16. There's a huge amount of change as the brain basically, sort of like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. You have the young form of a human brain kind of rewires. Now that it's learned culture, it sort of rewires to lock down into the format of an American or a Swede or whatever. And this is exactly the period, unfortunately, when we put our kids on social media and let random weirdos on the internet control how their brain is rewiring. One of the main things that is happening is in the prefrontal cortex. That's the last part to really go through the change, which is the seat of executive function. That is the ability to formulate a goal, figure out the means to achieve the goal, and then execute the plan to achieve the goal. So if you want to do your homework, I want to watch this TV show at 10 o'clock tonight, so I have an hour. I better do my homework. I have 1 hour. Kids struggle to do that, especially if you don't love doing your homework. It's going to take concentration and willpower to stay on task. But what happens? You have an infinite number of really fun digital experiences just waiting for you if you touch the right buttons. But it's much more than that because you don't have to touch the right buttons. The pop-ups are going to be popping up saying, come play, come out, come look what someone just said about you. So they're getting, I think on average now, 250 notifications a day is what American teens now get. That's 250 times a day that their attention is interrupted. Most of them don't put it on a focus mode. They just take it as normal, that any company that wants to take some of their attention can just take it. So it was always hard for teens to focus and do their homework or do anything. But doing that gives you practice in doing it. And if you do it repeatedly, you're actually helping your brain to develop good executive function. So what would happen if you have a teen who never gets to practice that? They literally never get an hour without an interruption. I think it could lead to permanent decrements in their ability to function as an adult.
I think that it's important to highlight that we don't know yet. It's still too early, but it's a reasonable supposition that Jonathan Haidt identifies here. 250 notifications a day. I've watched my kids and how much their phones ding, and my kids are pretty light on compared to what I see in other places. This point about practicing ignoring, helping kids to recognize that they don't have to respond to every message the second it comes through, that they can leave things on read or even on unread for more than 5 or 10 minutes, in fact, for an hour or two. Letting them sit with that, letting them learn how to do that is such a vital skill, and it will be good for their well-being. So the last thing that I'm going to share with you as we wrap up this really important conversation from Jonathan Haidt and what's going on in his book, The Anxious Generation, why our kids are struggling so much. We're going to talk about this idea of social media addiction. When I wrote my book, 10 Things Every Parent Needs to Know, I made it really clear that addiction is a bit of a funny word in psychological terms, and most of the time researchers try to avoid it unless they're genuinely talking about addiction. The more appropriate term, which Haidt will mention in just a sec, is problematic internet use. And I wrote an entire chapter about this idea and even included, with the permission of the author of the scale, a way of measuring whether or not your child is experiencing problematic internet use. But here's Jonathan Haidt from his conversation with Barry Weiss on the Honestly podcast, talking about social media addiction and whether it's the thing.
The better term to use is what they call problematic use. So, if you're spending 4 hours a day on Instagram, but you're still seeing your friends, you're still getting good grades in class. It's a time suck, but you can't say that it's interfering with basically love and work, are the two areas that psychologists look at. Love and work, basically relationships and either, work or schoolwork. So if you're doing fine on those, well, okay, then maybe it's your choice. But wherever we look, the numbers come out between 5 and 15% as having problematic use. So video games are tremendous fun. Boys really defend them and they don't want them taken away. But it turns out about 5 to 15% have problematic use where they can't stop. They're surly with their parents. If they're deprived for a day or two, they get really surly and maybe even aggressive. It's interfering with their schoolwork, with their ability to function with friends. So people say, oh, my kids are fine, or, most kids are doing okay. Sure, most are. But can you think of any consumer product in the world where if there was a 1 in 10 chance that your kid uses it, they're going to get hooked and have problematic behavior to the point where it's going to interfere with other life domains? And if they do it for 2 or 3 hours a day over many years, it could change their brain development. Is there any other product that we would ever let our kids use? So that's the way I think about it.
He's such a great communicator. That final point brings it home. It's one thing to say there's 5 or 10% of kids who have this challenge, but when you talk about creating a product and allowing them to use it, knowing that, it really shifts the conversation. I think this book is going to be one of the most important books to be published this year. If you haven't ordered it already, it's called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. I would encourage you to check it out. I can't wait to tell you about my review of it once mine finally arrives and I get to talk about it. But because it's been so topical, I really wanted to bring you those snippets and create the conversation for you in your home with your kids around such a challenging idea. The Happy Families podcast is back tomorrow. We've started a new segment. Once a month, we ask the question, is it just me? Tomorrow, is it just me, or am I the only one not interested in intimacy with my partner? We've got your reactions, your comments, and a few tips and ideas from Kylie and I as we answer the question, is it just me? The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. For more information about making your family happier, please visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.